Tanto tiempo disfrutamos de este amor, nuestras almas se acercaron, tanto así que yo guardo tu sabor, como tú llevas también sabor a mí.
Or on Zoom on the 28th. With that announcement, I'm very delighted to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Estevan Azcona, Assistant Research Social Scientist at the Southwest Center and Assistant Professor of Mexican American Studies. And let me just tell you briefly about Estevan before he tells us about Los Lobos. Estevan has been active in the world of Chicano Latino arts and culture for over 20 years as a scholar, arts presenter, and musician. He studied ethnomusicology and Mexican American studies at the University of Texas at Austin, where he received his doctoral degree. He's taught ethnomusicology and Chicano Latino music, history, and culture at the University of Texas at Austin, at Indiana University, DePaul University, University of Houston, and San Jose State. And welcome to those of you who are arriving. Help yourself to refreshments. Esteban's research and teaching interests lie at the intersections of Chicano Latino music, history, and folklore, Latin American ethnomusicology, and borderlands anthropology and history. He is particularly interested in how ethnic Mexican music making represents processes of cultural and political change and exchange. He's also co-producer of the Smithsonian Folkways Recordings release, Rolas de Aztlán, Songs of the Chicano Movement. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to you. Thank you, Estevan.
Thank you, Robin. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to share with you a little bit of my work. I want to thank Robin and Gary and everyone in the series committee for inviting me to be a part of the series. And I want to just sort of take this opportunity to thank my colleagues in the Southwest Center, all the faculty and staff there, as well as in Mexican American Studies, for making this my first year here at the University of Arizona so welcoming. I've been doing research about the Chicano Movement for a number of years now, so this is my first chance here while being on campus to share that. And so I thank everyone coming. I look forward to our conversation. And as you know, today I'll be talking about the group. Well, the title says Los Lobos. I'll be talking about them in their earliest iteration as Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles. And so I think there's something about their story that you'll find interesting, or I think will ask us interesting questions about what is Movimiento music. But I'll be telling this story in large part through the perspective of their founder or co-founder, Francisco Gonzalez. So I chose to tell the group story in this manner, partly due to his time with Los Lobos was before they became a well-known rock and roll group. And so his experience is central to what I want to talk about. But of course, he also had a moment here in Tucson, performing here and there. He had a long-standing collaboration with Michael Ronstadt, worked with youth at the among the Pascuayaqui, recorded an album here in 2009 called The Gift or El Regalo. Harvey Brooks was the producer on that. And you know, more recently, this was happening after he left Tucson, but I do want to mention it. You know, work that he had been doing with acclaimed jarocho harpist Mario Barradas has just been published by a book through UT Press. Mario Barradas and Son Jarocho, The Journey of a Mexican Regional Music, co-written with his wife, Chicano Studies scholar Yolanda Borges Gonzalez, and Mexican researcher Rafael Figueroa Hernandez. But I mostly want to share his story because he was my teacher and my mentor. And I stand in front of you here today in large part due to his influence. A year ago, almost to the day, Francisco passed away. So I wanted to share an amazing part of his longer and even more amazing story in Chicano music. So today, here we are in 2023. It's also the 50th anniversary of the forming of Los Lobos itself. So it was in the summer of '73 when they came together. So we'll be talking about this small group of musicians from East LA getting together, listening and learning Mexican music. But let me start with an event that was separate and happened a couple of years earlier. So in 1971, a group of young Chicano artists gathered in Mexico City in a meeting with their Mexican counterpart to talk about the role of arts in efforts for social change, most specifically theater. And this newspaper article from the Mexico City Daily Excelsior interviewed a number of those participants and shared this. And there's no way you could read it, so I'll give you a little bit of a synopsis. The Chicano movement in the United States utilizes theater, the plastic arts, music, dance, and literature as a form of guerrilla cultural for the attainment of social change in the world. The guerrilla cultural, which is formed by all Toltecas, and referring to artists, burst into the barrios suddenly, taking over walls, painting murals, developing stages for theater, music, dance, songs, and poetry in order to create a consciousness, not just between Chicanos, but about the need for social change. This newspaper article does well to locate the energy artists brought to the Chicano movement and the efforts of participants and organizers towards that change. The concept speaks to the imagination Chicano artists had or were having, not only their role in the movement, but also the tactics necessary to have impact. It acknowledges the social conflict between Mexicans and Anglos that began the 19th century. And of course, it is a romantic view of the guerrilla, suggesting impassioned, even militant commitment to movement goals. The heightened movement of the late 1960s with the full-scale war in Vietnam, assassinations of various political figures in the US, the arrival of the Black Panthers and their Chicano counterparts, the Brown Berets, however, made somewhat more real the romantic notion of fighting for the cause. The varying levels of violence, structural and manifest, felt by Chicano youth, like their peers of color, created the feelings to need a revolutionary fervor and rhetoric. The Excelsior article also notes the operational tactics of the guerrilla, right, as they take over public space, right, and creating resources for artistic vehicles. And it similarly acknowledges that its social base, comprising those who don't have great resources in terms of financial or political capital to resolve their problems in conventional manners, had to turn to more creative solutions, right, to forward their social conditions and struggle. At these sites and increasingly in everyday life, music played a critical role for people to reclaim their Mexicanness and express revolutionary sensibilities offered by the guerrilla cultural. This is largely experienced musically through various genres of protest songs. These are adaptations of labor songs, union songs, civil rights songs, think freedom songs of the African-American civil rights era, political songs of other social movements such as Nueva Canción or the songs of Carlos Puebla of Cuba, post-revolution there. And of course, extensive use of the corrido, both the Mexican Revolutionary era versions as well as new corridos written by movement composers. So between huelga and strike songs of the United Farm Workers, revolutionary corridos, and the sounds of various Mexican folk instruments triggered a complex of collective memory, imagined community, and new public identities of Chicana and Chicano. So I tend to talk a lot, so I'm going to also be playing you some clips. These clips are from a 1975 mini documentary about Los Lobos that was produced by the local PBS station, KCET. We're only going to see some clips. So for those of you who are really interested, I invite you to search for this on YouTube and find it and enjoy the full documentary, as it captures not just their music in the specific moment. It's one of the few, it might be even the only such resource of what Los Lobos sounded like in the 1970s, but you also get the personality of the group members and their collective vibe. So some of the clips will be long. You'll enjoy the music. So people online couldn't hear, give them a chance to. Why can't we just continue listening, right? From East LA, Los Lobos was one of the most active and popular groups of the period. Although not critically acclaimed for their rock music, the members of the group would tell you that Los Lobos, the rock band, is not the same thing as those five Chicano youth who sat around listening to their parents' records of Mexican music in the early 1970s. It was there that their subtle intervention into movement politics began. Neighborhood and high school friends. In this year, this is 1975, but 2 years earlier when they started the group, they had only recently graduated from high school. Right? And so we're talking late teens, early 20s. They were playing in rock and roll bands, whether they were performing locally or just performing in their garages or in their houses. And theirs was, in this time, in this moment, a time of being 19, 20 years old, right? T-shirts, jeans, long hair, beards, listening to Frank Zappa, the surrealist comedy of Fire Sign Theater. Anyone know Fire Sign Theater? Right, of course, there we go. The biting social comedy of Lenny Bruce and watching Fellini movies. They also shared memories as children hearing Spanish language music booming throughout the house. But that was sounds of growing up ethnic Mexican more so than it was the sounds of their sort of musical activity entering the 1970s. With the Chicano movement happening all around them, it sparked an impulse and they began steeping themselves in the sounds of huapango and son from the Huasteco and Jarocho traditions of Eastern Central Mexico. So they sought out the sounds of their parents' record collections and the challenge that music posed to them as musicians. Listening to those records of ranchera singer Miguel Aceves Mejia, huapango and son jarocho of groups like Los Nacionales de Jacinto Gatica and Conjunto Medellín, Los Lobos began learning Mexican popular and regional folk music, all the while slowly putting down or slowly dropping the rock and R&B music that they had grown up playing. Says Francisco Gonzalez, we just wanted to play something for our mothers. It was a way for us to show them that we cared about Mexican music. Luis Perez, another member, stated that we fell in love with the musicality, the challenge that it was to play this music. As musicians, we appreciated that challenge. Right? And so, little did they know that this started listening to these records. In it, they would find something that would define them like they couldn't have imagined. So let me play you a little bit more.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3.
Stay in tune, too, man.
Okay.
We want to make the past part of our music. We want to make a truly Chicano music that draws from our past, that is in line with the past, the present, and hopefully the future. I'm Frank Gonzalez, and the name of the group is Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles.
Francisco Gonzalez was born and raised in East Los Angeles and was a musician for most of his life. His musical story includes a wide range of experiences from performing various musical styles as a teenager before Los Lobos to his post-Lobos work as things such as musical director of El Teatro Campesino, various musical and cultural theater projects in California, extensive performance and recording resume, starting Guadalupe Custom Strings, a small business that created quality strings for traditional instruments, and not to mention mentoring the next generation of musicians and artists. Born into a musical family, the youngest of 7, his father was a trained singer and performed locally. His mother also sang, and all his siblings were musically active. Playing different instruments as a child, he landed on stringed instruments in junior high school when he started playing upright bass and guitar. In the early 70s, he was a music student at Pomona College and had been performing various styles of American popular music with neighborhood friends and up-and-coming LA musicians. He, like so many Chicano musicians of East LA, was well-versed in the music of soul and rock of that period, but also had ample experience with classical music, country, and the jazz scene. His was an eclectic musical youth, noted Chris Morris, of the author of the book Los Lobos, Dream in Blue, A Recent History of the Band. It was precisely this eclecticism, however, that was beginning to bother Gonzalez. This flowering of the movement, began to, his musical background began for him to pose personal problems. He said, one of the things I always felt uncomfortable with was the fact that I was a chameleon. I could play anything, right? And by this, could continue. He says, I didn't know anything about my own Mexican music, and that was a big embarrassment to me. So he was feeling the need to connect the ideals of the movement, right, with his own personal expression musically. And so he began then to explore the history, culture, and performance of Mexican music. And in doing so, he shares further, the first time I started getting into huapango and actually playing it, it was like in The Wizard of Oz, when it goes from black and white to color. I wasn't in Kansas anymore. I was in a whole different world, and it just blew me away, especially when I realized I could sing and play it. The forces of assimilation, along with the experience of second-class citizenship, placed home culture on the back burner for ethnic Mexican youth in the 1970s. These feelings of embarrassment for youth in the context of US mainstream culture, because Mexican culture was not valorized, were now being turned on its head due to social and cultural shifts. Right? The embarrassment that Gonzalez felt for not knowing Mexican music as well as he knew US popular music. So through the band, Gonzalez and the Lobos became well known locally and within movement art circles as expositors of regional Mexican music. This platform of Mexican traditional music, with its elaborate rhythms and wide range of folk guitars, gave the group an unexpected musical voice. Most importantly, their commitment to Mexican regional music was an intergenerational bridge from community youth to community elders, a unifying gesture connecting Mexican and Chicano cultures in the bodies of those present who found themselves moving to the music, dancing, as well as feeling emotionally and politically moved. So let's listen further while they work on that song, right?
Okay, here we go. This is it. We're right in the front. The forum.
Try it.
Try it for realsies.
For realsies.
The fabulous forum. Fabulous forum.
Let's go.
1, 2, 3.
Chicanos somos señores y venimos a cantar, y venimos a cantar. Chicanos somos señores.
Ese
let me talk a little bit more about this and just throw in some thoughts about social movements. That social movements can offer the space for cultural transformation is undeniable. According to Melucci, social movements are prime sites for symbolic action in the meaning collective behavior, identity formation, and transformation of self. The historical moment that marks social movement, however brief, is generally overflowing with creative turmoil that sparks new ways of thinking about who we are, right? Alberoni suggests the process of historicization through which the past is reinterpreted in terms of present needs, appraising resources for current struggle. By combining the political and expressive resources, Ironman and Jameson contend that social movements contribute to the transformation of cultural traditions, right? How else does conjunto music, as Manuel Peña puts it, transform itself from cantina trash to cultural icon? The study of music and social movements, however, need not be limited, or we shouldn't assume a homologous relationship between them, right? The supposed fit between aesthetic and social values and musical expression is at most effective essentialist. Historicizing the past while symbolically solidifying ties to a cultural heritage may also overlook the hybridizing processes and forms necessary to either make the past appealing in the present, or they are so much a part of the present that they form part of the new identity. And Simon Frith probes these tensions with popular music in the context of globalization and the practice of disparate groups producing and listening to music, the creation and construction of musical and aesthetic experiences outside of the diet of culture and place. In the context of Chicano music, this begs the question, what is Mexican about Chicanos playing rock and roll? Or how do the Mexican folk genres of son and huapango begin to sound Chicano? As Fritz suggests, the issue is not, quote, that social groups agree upon social values that are then expressed through cultural activity, but that they get to know themselves as groups through cultural activity. So I want to show how this plays out, these tensions play out in Movimiento music. By the early 1970s, music of the movement or Movimiento music, via the developing notion of the guerrilla cultural, had established a largely uncanny nationalist voice that spoke out against the history of discriminatory practices and policies that placed the Mexicans in a position of second-class citizenship. I use this term uncanny, from George Mariscal's depiction of movement era politics as an uncanny mix of revolutionary or progressive nationalism with a narrow or more regressive elements. Themes of identity, revolution, indigeneity, and homeland were common in the songs that were being composed at this time. And these songs also complemented other speech genres already at play in social movements, right? With songs, you have speeches, and you also have shouting, you have gritos, you have sloganeering. There's this speech, there are numerous speech genres, and that provide this vibrant soundscape. The overtly political songs are just that, political songs, and not always the appealing genre as it may seem. For example, older ethnic Mexican generations who may have been confused or even hostile towards the younger generations calling themselves Chicanos did not quite take to protest music that celebrated Chicano-ness. That doesn't mean that it didn't necessarily support movement objectives. And others were not taken in by the sloganeering that seemed to define Movimiento music. So I want to look at a rally in Southern California in the mid-1970s to illustrate this. We have groups coming from different parts of the state, so it suggests it was a fairly big rally, but no one could remember. They just played at so many rallies. So I'm talking about two groups in particular who give us this scenario. One of those groups is Flor del Pueblo of San Jose, California. And like other groups of the time, Flor performed an explicitly politically themed repertoire with original tunes, huelga songs, and covers of music from the Nueva Canción tradition and songs of Carlos Pueblo, Cuba. If there is a Chicano Nueva Canción, it is identified by Flor del Pueblo. Largely a family-based group, they were accomplished musicians, also influenced by the style of the U.S. folk revival movement and artists such as Peter, Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, and others. And they even had a song published in Sing Out magazine. So let's hear a little bit of Flor del Pueblo La Mujer by Carlos Pueblo. Good song, right? The internationalism of Flor reflected not only their Bay Area California roots, but also the emerging internationalist politics within the Chicano movement. They were the first group to play at Berkeley's La Peña Cultural Center, for those who know this important site. And with their song repertoire, the political rap of their elder member, Pancho Rodriguez, there's no mistaking the politicalness of the music of Flor del Pueblo. So as Flor finishes their set, the next group to play is Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles. And as the Lobos are setting up with the sound and message of Flor's music still wafting in the air, Francisco Gonzalez steps up to the microphone and says to the crowd, just so you know, we don't play political music. Right? Without a doubt, this is a peculiar thing to say at a Chicano movement rally, but this statement exposes a tension that defines the relationship between music and politics in the movement. So the obvious question becomes, well, what is political music to the Lobos? And in short, conventional protest songs, right? The activist ethos that informed the Guerrilla Cultural saw art broadly to be utilized as tools for community organizing, for political agitating, for struggling for change. In Movimiento music, this was created through songs with politicized lyrics that provided messages of resistance, identity, cultural pride, historical consciousness. Songs may be of various Mexican song genres, like rancheras, corridos, but it is a lyrical content that drives the identity and function of the song. So in this context, Gonzalez states, the difference between us and them is that they would use music as a medium to espouse the politics. With us, music was the politics, what we were doing and how we were doing it. The return to roots for Gonzalez and Los Lobos, influenced as it was by the Chicano movement, still maintained, a strict allegiance to their identity as Chicanos. For Gonzalez and the Lobos, their distinction from their Movimiento music brethren is that their approach was not as student activists, but as experienced musicians. They formed at the moment Latin American styles were beginning to proliferate within movement music circles. And their search, however, was not for new forms of protest song, but rather the exploration of Mexican forms as accomplished musicians. Their discipline focused on performing things musically Mexican, was not an exclusionary value, but rather a commitment towards demonstrating the powerful effect of everyday culture within the ethos of the social movement. For Gonzalez, leaving behind his chameleon self, right, that playing of everybody else's music, and turning fully to the world of Mexican music was his own act of rebellion or solidarity. Where other musicians went either towards mainstream rock and popular music, with or without political overtones, or to straight ahead protest music in the styles of Pete Seeger, John Baez, or Nueva Canción, Los Lobos went for straight ahead regional Mexican music. To them, it wasn't about lyrical message, but rather the message of musical style and identity, as no one else was playing it, at least from the rock and roll scene that they were coming to. So Los Lobos' politics were not about the confrontation and declaration of the protest song, but rather the meaning of reclaiming culture as musicians and the transformation of the self. But this transformation set off by Mexican music did not betray their Chicano identity, right? So this meant playing Mexican music, but keeping their beards, right? wearing Pendletons to their gigs, not speaking Spanish in between songs, right? And while some of them couldn't speak Spanish fluently anyway, the point was not to hide their Chicano roots in their exploration of Mexican music. I want to try out another idea as well with you all. So these are information. And that is the role of play and irreverence. Gonzalez's "We Don't Play Political Music" line was made in the context of performing with fellow musicians and friends from the group Flor del Pueblo. It was a statement to the crowd and one that Gonzalez meant, but it could simultaneously have been a friendly jab at the seriousness of the songs that Flor performed. They developed for themselves an interesting platform through Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles, as they were rock musicians who turned away from rock to play traditional music. At the same time, they were a Movimiento band, right, that avoided protest music. This inside but outside point of view, along with being a group of 20, 21, 22-year-old guys, questioning authority and not genuflecting on cue to that authority probably came a little easy. The chance to take the stuffing out of the seriousness of movement politics, especially within the musical sphere, all the while feeling wholeheartedly a part of it, was likely a delicious possibility for the group. For example, the numerous corridos of the Mexican Revolution, numerous corridos of the Mexican Revolution that exalt the figure of Francisco Pancho Villa, general of the División del Norte, right, who were fighting for reforms that would benefit the masses. My family is from Durango, and Villa, being born in Durango, if I had a nickel for every time someone in my family told me Pancho Villa is your grandfather, it'd be wealthy. So Movimiento groups playing corridos from the Villa cycle was a common occurrence, right? As revolutionary heroes like him and Emiliano Zapata were widely celebrated. So let me play a clip to Gonzalez's introduction of the song Siete Leguas.
This next tune is a revolutionary song from the Mexican Revolution, and it's about a very, very famous horse and his very, very famous fat rider known as Pancho Villa. So we're going to dedicate this song to him, and it's called Siete Leguas.
So no doubt worse things have been said about Pancho Villa. But the irreverent comment here likely would have turned some heads within the movement. And in addition, Los Lobos, with their cleaned up but not clean cut look, was perhaps another playful toying with performance conventions, thinking about how Mexican musicians of these traditional, of these regional traditions would have presented themselves. The irreverence of the Lobos was not about a lack of respect for movement leaders or musicians or even Pancho Villa, but rather about a youthful and likely cheeky engagement about what it meant to act politically. And for the Lobos, that meant the manner in which they were approaching this music. So let me conclude with saying that Los Lobos offered not merely the regional traditional music of Mexico, but that this same music interpreted through a Chicano voice. The idea here is that the sound of this music was distinct from its source material in Mexico, due in part on the surface, right, to Chicano Spanish language practices, but also their approach to the musical instruments as they brought popular music sensibilities to traditional music. I believe their appeal to movement audiences was deeper than the symbolic gestures of performing traditional styles, important as that was. The way they sounded connected with Chicano audiences, as the Lobos demonstrated how huapangos and sones could sound both within tradition, yet genuinely Chicano. Their performances, marked by Chicano speech, barrio dress, informed by movement aesthetics, gave context to the musical sound of their voices and the traditional instruments in a way that profoundly resonated with movement audiences. And by extension, is this affective formula would serve them later in their years as a rock and roll band as they explored how Mexican rock music could be, at least from a Chicano perspective. Chicano performers in the mainstream are confronted by the cultural costs of remaining in the mainstream, either diluting their art to be marketable to wider audiences and thus losing organic connection to community, or shedding the political potential of their art towards the same end. Musically, however, there's no doubt Los Lobos del Este de Los Angeles define the line that brings Chicano music to broader audiences, both within the movement and beyond. And their example, like those of other movement musicians ensembles, paved the way for the next generation of Chicana and Chicano musicians. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now turn to questions and answers. I realize I didn't introduce myself. I'm Dr. Robin Reinecke of the Southwest Center, anthropologist, and chair of the lecture series committee at the Southwest Center. And we're just so happy to have Estevan share more about his work with us. New member of the faculty on campus, so it's really a treat. While you're warming up your questions, I have a question for you, which is, do you have any personal stories you can share about either the impact of Los Lobos for you or about Frank and your memories of him?
Wow. Yeah, I will overflow. I'll start crying if I think about them too much. But he was, for anyone who's met him, a very strong personality, challenged you intellectually, challenged you musically, but was much more than that. And so my regard for him is very high, and I always enjoy the opportunity to talk about him, and especially people who knew him as well. It's always an interesting conversation. But I would say, you know, for me, in thinking about this from a personal perspective, and the opportunities I've had to perform music outside of a very specific tradition, you know, say like mariachi, so for example, I had a group with friends in Austin, Texas, called Mitote, and we played a wide range of Mexican song, of the various song traditions of Mexico. And it could not be other than to have Los Lobos in the back of our minds and whatever we were doing, because, you know, we didn't create that context, we didn't create that practice, that existed, you know. And even for the Lobos, you know, I didn't have a chance to tell it in this story. They weren't the first Chicanos in East LA to be playing son jarocho either. There was a generation before them, musicians like Goyo Gutierrez, Bobby Chagoya, and their group Conjunto Papaloapan, right? They're the ones who were trying to do this in the 50s and 60s. And so when the Lobos were doing this, they didn't know any of that. And it just took them a little bit of time of searching things out, and they began to find these other musicians who would help them along the way. And so, you know, for us doing what we were doing in the 2000s, you know, we had that model for us to make music in that way and to think about what we were doing and why we were doing it. But thank you for that question.
For your presentation. My name's Bob Diaz, and I work in special collections here. And I've been a long time aficionado of this music. And Los Lobos participated in 1977 in the production of an album called Si Se Puede, which was a fundraiser for the United Farm Workers. And the music is overtly political. I do know that they had a falling out at some point with Francisco, and I don't know if they recorded that particular album after or before that occurred. But if you look up that album, it's a great album. It features the vocals of a lady named Carmen Moreno, and it has some classic protest songs on it. So I was experiencing a little bit of cognitive dissonance when you were talking about them not being political, because I know that they did take a good part in that particular recording.
Thank you for bringing that up. So the Si Se Puede album was the, you know, project of Art Brambilla, who's a promoter in East LA, and came up with the idea to do a project that would help promote the UFW. And so the Lobos were the house band for that particular project. So they weren't writing those songs, nor were they singing those songs. So they played the music behind, and then the Salas brothers sang on it, Carmen Cristina Moreno sang on it. There were other local acts that were associated with Brambilla, and so it's a very exciting record for those who have had a chance to listen to it, and those who are interested. You may still be able to go to the UFW website and find it. Every now and then they have those in print. It's so I don't think those songs in particular are associated with them in the sense that they were that was their music, but they did one track called Te Lingo Lingo, which is a fun jarocho song. If I play it now, we'd all start dancing in like 3 seconds. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. They have that cachet, and that will attract people to it. And their sound is on it. But I would think they would sort of separate themselves from the lyrics of those songs, not to take credit for them in that respect. But Te Lingo Lingo, which has no political lyrics necessarily to it, it was the one time when they actually did write political lyrics. And so there's references to the lettuce strike and to the grape strike, and so that's about the extent that they went. When we created Rolas de Aztlán for the Smithsonian, of course we wanted the Lobos on it, and we got the first track off that album, which is them playing De Colores, right? And that's the only track on the album that has Francisco on it. After they record that track, it was while they're recording the album that the split happened. So he's not on the rest of the album. But that harp you hear in the first song, De Colores, that is him. And so we want them on it outside of De Colores, because it's not them singing. There's the children from a local school who are singing the song. It's a really beautiful song or track. And we didn't know what they would agree to donate to the CD compilation. I wanted what we heard here at the very beginning. They had that tema of Chicano Somos Señores going into El Torito, but they didn't want to give us that. Or I don't know, I wasn't a part of that conversation. And so they ended up giving us El Te Lingo Lingo, but I wanted something that was more reflective of what they would typically play at all the things. So you are right, there is something in that album that contradicts a little bit of what I'm saying. But by and large, that was one of the few examples of them engaging in political lyrics. Great question. So the Lobos recent concert here last month in Tucson was a rocking one for those of you who missed it. It was great. I was happy to be there. And I would say, I don't know the demographic. It's, I was in the back with my mask on. So it's hard to tell all who showed up and what the split was. But this is a group that has learned how to share their voice with the world, and still make connection. And so there is something about their music that connects. And so when you think about their albums as a rock band, which I don't talk about here, you think about their albums with the rock band, there are a lot of themes that resonate with us that are human themes. And a lot of them are centered in immigrant experiences or experiences of marginalization, really beautiful songs that come out of their social conditions, right? And their perspective as Chicanos, but they write them in a way that is inclusive. As for where were the raza at that show, I'm sure they were there. I was there. So, and the people I went with are raza, but it's not surprising that they attract a very wide audience. Wide, I didn't, not white. Yes.
I can't help but comment on that. They were here the year before at the Rialto Theater, and it was full of raza. I think it's the venue combined with the cost. But they played one year at Kennedy Park, and the park was just full of people. Oh, yeah. Our people love Los Lobos. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely. I mean, we went to see them in where did we go? Bisbee, right? And so yeah, it's I think it's really, but they have a wide appeal, and I don't necessarily agree that raza went there. Maybe no, I agree. They bring out people from the community, but they also bring out people from all sectors. Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about their interaction with the Black community in LA? Because again, they were sampling, and I mean, Los Lobos as a rock band has always done everything from Marvin Gaye to the staple singers. And so they're immersed in all that all around them. And how do you think that weaves into their whole story?
Well, they had a long history. I don't want to say long because they weren't that old, but some of them had history performing in clubs and in the African American community before the start of the Lobos, and then of course afterwards. I'm sure there are many projects that took them there. Conrad Lozano played in numerous. He's the bass player of the group. He was in the group Tierra. He played with the Salas brothers. The East LA rock scene of the 1960s going into the 1970s wasn't necessarily a rock scene in the way we might think of classic rock. They were a rock scene that was more in line with R&B. That was a lot closer to the aesthetics of that time. In fact, Chicano popular music of that era is thought of as brown-eyed soul, right? And in that, they are performing in the ethnic Mexican community, but also performing in the African American community. And it's a space in which they shared with African American artists. And so you have, there is a blurring of the lines there that's taking place. And that is formative of who they were as musicians before stepping into this world of Mexican traditional music. And so I think that was there in understanding what it meant to be a Chicano rock and roller in that time period. I mean, they're looking up to the Midnighters, and they're looking up to some of these groups that lived in that were performing in that world that blurred those lines. Post movement and becoming a rock band, there's a whole other set of parameters that are involved. Francisco, and just a little bit of his story, he performed widely, lots of different kinds of styles. This was that chameleon-like sensibility that he was bothered by. But he was, an accomplished musician and was playing in jazz groups with some of the up-and-coming jazz artists of the African American community. And I think it was really in those interactions where he was feeling this. In that moment of the late 1960s, early 1970s, and coming across these Black artists who are making those connections between their music and their culture and the ideals of the civil rights era, and feeling like, wait, how come I'm not doing that? Why am I playing jazz, or why am I playing these other musics? Why I need to speak something that is going to be a little more fundamental.
So does that only go into the root space?
I think his leaving the group is fairly complicated, and I think there are lots of small and major things that are a part of that story. I think the Lobos went in the direction that they ultimately went because that was a natural next step. Having put down those electric guitars didn't mean they stopped listening to that music, and that music was fundamental to their experience as musicians. The performance of the Mexican traditional music was something that complemented them in terms of their identity. But as they moved forward and began to take advantages of the opportunities that they were facing, they found themselves with a new platform to begin to merge, and that's why you see in those early Lobos records, maybe not so much the folk guitars, but you get the accordion and the bajo sexto. They started to bring in rock and roll, rockabilly, conjunto music, and talking to, going over my interviews with Louis, he was telling me that they always made sure, and on those albums, that now as recording artists, that there was something that still reflected back to the culture. And so whether that's Ay Te Dejo in San Antonio, or the new compositions where they were doing really interesting sort of experimental pieces, like doing wapangos, but in English, like Be Still. I think that's on the Neighborhood album. This really beautiful, work where they were playing with this breadth of experience that they had in the 1980s going into the 1990s.
Just a couple comments and questions from Zoom. So our friend Barclay Goldsmith commented, Francisco composed and arranged music for a Borderlands Theater 1986 staged reading of Los Muertos Nunca Mueren in conjunction with the touring Casa Sola photo exhibit that they toured here. The readings were from the Mexican Revolution. The music was very important in evoking the work of Juan Rulfo. And then there's two questions. That's just a nice local history comment. But one has to do with if you can comment on the psychological well-being impact for Chicano music for young Chicano people. There's a long comment, but just to summarize, if you have any comments on that. And then there is a question that has to do with, that's from Roberto Velasquez. If there are or were regional differences in how the Lobos affected Mexican-American communities. So kind of interrelated questions there.
If there are local
regional differences in how the Lobos affected Mexican-American communities. So was this maybe, different at the border than it was farther north, or if you know any regional differences?
That'd be interesting. Sort of think about and collect information about. When we think of Chicano music, it's not a singular thing, right? Chicano music isn't only Los Lobos, right? There are regionalisms within Chicano music, and so whether we're talking about musics that are coming out of Texas, which are distinct from music we're going to hear in California, which are distinct from musics we're going to hear in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, which are distinct from musics that we're going to hear in the borderlands, both here in the Sonoran borderlands, the San Diego, Tijuana region, and so on and so forth. And so there's a multiplicity of expressions that are part of there. And so how the Lobos, perhaps how they're received, how they're heard in different regions would be interesting to know. It'd be interesting to know how Tejano audiences hear the Los Lobos having the long history of conjunto music that they have. Like, how do they fit into this world that we have that's already established and stable? Or in Francisco's point of view, what the Lobos did in that time and in that moment could only really happen in Los Angeles because there was a long history of a particular practice of accordion-based music and orquesta music in Texas, entering the era of the movement. And they're similar, you could say, about other regions of the Southwest, California, or at least Los Angeles as a metropolis, and the wide diversity that existed there, and the kind of blurred lines that existed between different communities of color. You get a wide range of expression there, both that is fundamentally Mexican in approach, but also things like Brown Eyed Soul, which is bringing in African-American and Chicano aesthetics into music making. And so, there was for Gonzalez a sort of a right moment for what they were doing to happen in that moment. So I don't know how fully I could speak to the sort of wider reception of them, other than the fact that in their thinking about their later years and the ways in which they were trying to maintain in their recordings, something that spoke back to their roots. So as much as they're creating songs and creating rock songs, and whether this had to do with doing them in English or not, I think they're always trying to find those connections. And then that perhaps was a way for them to explore the regionalisms of the U.S. Southwest, in addition to other projects where they were exploring, they're continuing to incorporate Mexican traditional music.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious if besides Mexican musicians and music, what other influences from Latin America or intellectual influences mark Los Lobos production. Specifically, I'm curious to know if they embrace the concept of Latinoamérica Unida that was very important for Nueva Canción singers like Carlos Puebla or the movement at large in Latin America besides Mexicanidad. So if they felt some solidarity or if they expressed that in their songs to other countries or to Latin America as a region as a whole.
Yeah, I would say vaguely, yes. The project of the Lobos was explicitly about these traditions in Mexico and about an opportunity to express those through that Chicano voice, right? And through the way that they could in their approach to music making. But that didn't mean they weren't listening to music from other places. So, going over my interviews, I remember seeing one of the groups that was influential for them was a group called Los Incas, right? And so Los Incas, I don't know the full story of Los Incas, so I don't want to speak too much. But I don't know if they were a Peruvian group or a Bolivian group, a group that was engaged in Andean music. Outside of the Lobos, a couple of them had an Andean project. And so that wasn't something that they did as Los Lobos. That was something that I think Louis and David did for a particular, and they had other friends that they were doing. I don't know that that project ever did recordings or anything of that such. Their very first album, this was after Francisco had left the group, is referred to as the Yellow Album. Guess what color it is? But it is called Just Another Band from East LA. And in that album, you'll find El Cuchipe, which is a song that comes from South America. And I believe Maria Chuchena may be another song that also comes from outside of Mexico. And so they were listening widely. They knew, while their performance and their presentation of self on stage may have been predominantly Mexican in terms of the regional musics that they're performing, they listened widely. They were listening to other things. So in their search, I mean, even watching the performances here, you see the mandolins and the mandola. You'll find instruments that aren't, exclusively Mexican. And so they are incorporating the resources that they have and the interests that they had. And so those Latin American instruments, well, they may not have been as pronounced as, say, a group like Flor del Pueblo, which explicitly wanted to make connections with Cuba and Latin America. And that was central and front, along with the Mexican genres and their own original songs. I think with the Lobos, it's there. You just have to sort of sift through it and say, oh, wait, this song is from here, this song is from there. And of course, later on, they're writing cumbias, they're engaging in other things. But I brought up the Yellow Album for a reason. That's because in the CD release of it 20 years, 25 years later, right? Because it was only on record. I could only get that album that way. Now they have, I just bought the vinyl. It's really cool. It's not an original from 1978, but it's still cool to have it. It sits on our thing, and I haven't even opened it. Part of me doesn't want to open it at all. But the Yellow Album in the CD re-release has a plena on it. And so they were listening to other things. And perhaps in that, again, they're not being more explicit about those connections, but those connections did exist. Oh, Wanda, hi.
Jesus.
I know you're here. Hi, Wanda.
Hi, Estevan. What fabulous footage you have here. I'm very moved by seeing what you shared with us here. So I have a sort of political question, political of another kind, and I'm just curious if in your conversations, in your interviews, you talked about Aztlán, because that album, Good Morning Aztlán, relatively recent, I would say. I mean, I know it's been a while, but relatively recent. And it's just not an expression or idea that I hear very much. So whenever I do hear it, my ears perk up.
Yeah. So their album and song, Good Morning Aztlán, comes out, what, 2004 or 5, something like that. So this will tell you how long I've been doing this. That my interview with Louis predated that album. So I didn't get to say, Louis, tell me about Good Morning Aztlán. What's this about? You know, I don't have any words from the band with regard to what this song meant in that regard. In reading, you know, the biography by Chris Morris, he doesn't go into what the term Aztlán meant, right? Here's this term from their movement days that now 20, 30 years later is now present in their in that release in the 2000s. You know, is there a connect being made? And listening to the song, you know, it's a rock and roll song. It's a very high energy. I love the song actually, but it's there's no I think nationalist discourse behind it. I think it's perhaps a tip of the hat to those long-term aficionados, like for whom Aztlán has a meaning. And so I think Good Morning Aztlán is it like a Good Morning America? But no, it's Good Morning Aztlán kind of thing. This is all, you know, subjective here. I haven't come to any conclusions about it. Yeah, something like that. Of course, they have Cumbia de la Raza, right? So I think there's a language, a terminology that they still utilize. But I right now, off the top of my head, I think it's more of a tip of the hat to their history, more so than them engaging politically in a way that they perhaps didn't do in a previous time, at least in that explicit manner.
So we'll wrap up pretty soon, but just to share that there's a lot of Los Lobos intense love and nerdiness happening on the Zoom chat. And there's some friends of Francisco who are just sharing loving remembrances of him. So Neto Portillo asks to talk briefly about how Los Lobos influenced other Chicano groups, like Los Alacranes from San Diego, David Hidalgo's collaboration with Los Senzontles from the Bay Area. And then someone really wants you to talk about Chunky and the Alacranes Mojados.
Okay. So the Lobos weren't the, listening and watching this video, I only showed you parts, right? Because that's all I have time to do. And so when you watch the full video, you'll hear them sing Sabor a Mi. You'll hear the rendition of Siete Leguas. So you'll hear a wider sort of palette of what they were playing at that time in terms of Mexican music. And so what they were doing was certainly something that all other movement groups were hearing. As way, you can do that too, because a lot of them were like huelga songs and movimiento songs and protest songs, Nueva Canción, Carlos Puebla. And then hearing the Lobos do what they did, like, oh, wow, okay, let's do that too. And so, you know, that relationship between Flor and the Lobos, they had a little bit of interaction. Los Lobos came up with an original tune called Flor de Huevo, which was kind of again, this is why I think there's a reverence and a friendly jab to Flor de Pueblo, the group. So when Flor de Pueblo records their album, and I'm not remembering it right now who recorded first, but this all existed. So they responded with a huapango of their own that Eduardo Robledo composed called Poco a Poco. And so that was part of an influence that here these two groups were speaking to each other, and an influence of the Lobos, because Flor de Pueblo weren't necessarily playing huapangos. And so this was something which they began to engage with that. Chunky Sanchez of San Diego and Rick, his brother, and the group, Los Alacranes Mojados, featured in the film singing Our Way to Freedom. They were a group that comes out of San Diego, that comes out of a protest genre, largely around huelga songs out of San Diego State. But they had a teacher, Pepe Villarino, who was a trio musician. And so boleros was his world. And so they're learning boleros as well, playing with him. And for them, they sort of were doing, they had a similar thing. They weren't playing necessarily at first, the sones and huapangos, but for them, playing boleros had the same sort of political potential that the Lobos were doing with sones and huapangos. But again, hearing the Lobos and sharing the stage and seeing what they were doing, Chunky and the Alacranes took a fairly deep dive into son jarocho. And you watch the film Chicano Park, there is footage of them at Chicano Park Day doing, I forget the name of the song, but playing son jarocho there on the stage. And so they got to Chunky's last days, as much as he had that black guitar, 6-string guitar that he played all the time, he had his black jarana that he also played all the time. And so the jarana became a very close instrument to Chunky, and his brother Rick became a phenomenal requintero. And so that's just two examples of what the Lobos were doing with son and huapango that were influencing other groups. In terms of beyond that, I mentioned a little bit about my own experience with my group Mitote, but think about groups like Quetzal, right, who many consider have taken the torch from Los Lobos and are marching forward with an even wider array of ways of engaging with audiences, with community, through musical style, through what they're doing lyrically, but as well what they are doing outside of that in terms of the archivist practices that which they engage both within and outside of the group.
Why don't we do one more and then we'll close for the evening. It's getting late.
I'd just like to say that I think Los Lobos are quite political, even though they're not overtly that way. By singing Volver, Volver at the end of their shows and bringing everybody together in song and affirming our culture and our language, how political can you get? I think that's very political. Their songs affirm our culture. The lyrics do. And so I hope people don't go away thinking that they're not aware of the social conditions in which we live.
Of course, and I hope nobody walks away thinking that I'm saying that the Lobos were not political. The Los Lobos felt they were absolutely being political, but they felt they were being political by playing the music that they played in the way that they played it. They felt that's being political. Singing songs of, singing protest songs, yeah, that's political too. But what they were doing was they felt was even more impactful. And so it was never that they thought that they were not being political or that they shunned being political, right? I think they shunned the overtness of movement politics. That's the sort of cultural politics of Movimiento music, is like, what is this music politics divide? All of them are engaging politically, right? And the Lobos, in everything that I was talking about today, were absolutely engaging politically through their music. They just felt they didn't need to do it because a song lyric said, protest this or protest that. And so that was their intervention, of saying, we can do this, but we can do this by singing Volver, Volver. We can do this by playing this song. We can do this by putting our electric guitars away and listening to our parents' records, right? That shift in consciousness that took place was the most political act, I think, for them. And so, yeah, please, nobody walk away thinking, I'm saying Los Lobos aren't political because they didn't sing protest songs, or to the contrary, right? And so what they do is they demonstrate a sort of a wider political praxis that's taking place. That's not just about being explicit with your lyrics, but a praxis that's about how are you changing, right? Did you change after you sang this song, and whether it had political lyrics or not. And I think for them, they most definitely changed. And that's why they have become, you know, in many ways, what they have become. And so, yeah, thank you for, I want to make that explicit, that is by and far who they were and what they did and who they still are today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.
I'm gonna play some music, play us out.
All right.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Thanks for coming. We'll look forward to seeing you hopefully on the evening of Friday, April 28th.